All right, live. Okay, this is see how this goes. Not sure how this is gonna work. Do, 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 do. There we go. It's on YouTube. How about we get on X? All right. Well, I don't want to just not be talking when this is going on. So, hope everyone's doing good. It's been a crazy couple months, year. Uh, I've recorded a couple videos that just didn't record, and so I wasn't able to publish. So that's been annoying. Let's see. Can I show my screen? There we go. If you're in the chat, just go ahead and say something so that I know that you can hear me, because that'd be good. So this is going to be a little bit of a test here. What does this say? Yeah, boo boo doo doo doo. So it looks like I'm on YouTube. I'm seeing if I can get this to go on to X. It looks like it should be able to, but it doesn't look like it's happening, so that's fine. So, sounds good. Awesome. Thank you, Dean. All right. So, I'm going to start off by doing a little commentary here. I tried to make a video about the movie Lincoln, and it got completely copyrighted like instantly. Like I uploaded it and boom, just copyrighted instantly, which was a shame because it was like pretty long. So I'm just going to start playing this. You're just going to hear the audio. It's probably not going to be great. I want to do this because I'm not a huge, I'm a huge history buff. I'm a huge Civil War buff. I have been since I was 10. I went to the Gettysburg battlefield when I was 10, and that's kind of when I started researching that topic. And Lincoln is an interesting film in the sense that I think they went out of their way to try and make it look as authentic as they could. The costuming is great. The accents are great. They have a huge cast of amazing actors. People were just falling over themselves to go in this film. Like very famous actors were given like little cameos basically. And yet, despite all of that, I think that it's one of the most deceptive and dishonest films, despite the fact that it went out of its way to kind of topically be accurate. It covers a lot of ground that I think a lot of people today wouldn't be aware of. There's a lot of telescoping with history. This is just normal. This isn't a conspiracy theory or anything like that, but just so many events then just get condensed to the point where you don't really have any understanding of them anymore because you're skipping like all the context. And so this is zooming in and it's showing a lot of stuff that I think most people have never heard of or don't know about. In that sense, it's good. But then it kind of twists the history in a way to drive home a narrative that I think isn't justified. So let's go and so if you can hear this, this is set right after, apparently it's during the siege of Petersburg. It's implied to be happening right after the Battle of the Crater. So just a little bit of background here. The Civil War has been going on now for 3.5 years. It had always been violent. The summer of 1864 was unique in the sense that the violence was basically unending. Previously, there would be a massive battle, and then the armies would disengage, and then there'd be a massive battle, and the armies would disengage, more or less. Then there might be other conflicts and confrontations, but it wasn't. And of course, there were multiple fields and theaters, so there wasn't a day where nothing was going on. But a given army probably wasn't going to be fighting every day. In 1864, General Grant became the overall commander of the Union forces and basically said, we're just going to go until they're defeated. And so there was a long series of battles: the Wilderness, Pennsylvania, the Angle, St. Anne's, Cold Harbor, with Grant maneuvering closer and closer to Richmond, and eventually he almost took Petersburg, which was a major rail junction that supplied Richmond. But before he was able to actually take it, the Confederates got there, and it developed into a siege. And this is the longest siege of the war, I'm fairly certain. It's about 10-month siege. And when the siege ends in late March, early April of 1865, that's basically the end of the war. It's within a week, Lee surrenders. Within 2 weeks after that, I think Jefferson Davis is captured, and the war is kind of over. Interesting question when it actually ended, because there's a whole bunch of different things that kind of happened. You have the last time a certain arm, the Army of Northern Virginia surrenders. You have when Jefferson Davis is captured. You have when the various state governments capitulate. You have when the last naval vessel surrenders. There were legal ramifications about, because during the war, the Union soldiers, military would confiscate Confederate goods, but once the war was over, they couldn't do that anymore. So it became a legal question of like, when was that date? Because if it happened after that date, then the citizens at that point could seek restitution. If it happened before that date, they were rebels and they could be taken. So this is set apparently after the Battle of the Crater, during the siege of Petersburg. The entire movie takes place during the siege of Petersburg. Like when the movie ends, and I think it ends right at the end. Like he does eventually go to Richmond, I think, at the very end. So that's after the battle, but very, very late in the war. And Lincoln is here kind of reviewing the troops, and he is having a conversation with two black soldiers. And just right off the bat, this is just totally insane. I can't imagine that anything like this ever happened. Now, did Lincoln meet a lot of soldiers? Yes, absolutely, he did. He would go to hospitals. He would go to the field, especially with the Army of Potomac. He wasn't traveling, to the Midwest or anything like that, but he would meet with the Army of Potomac. He'd meet with the commanders, and he would meet with the soldiers. That in and of itself isn't too crazy, but the fact that he's talking to two black soldiers and the way that they're talking to him, that's the interesting thing. So let's just start this here.
Some of us was in the 2nd Kansas Colored. We fought the Rebs at Jenkins Ferry last April, just after they killed every Negro soldier they captured at Poison Springs. So at Jenkins Ferry, we decided we weren't taking no Reb prisoners, and we didn't leave one of them alive. The ones of us that didn't die that day, we joined up with the 116th U.S. Colored, sir, from Camp Nelson, Kentucky. Okay,
so this is a black soldier now admitting that he killed white prisoners intentionally. It was true that black soldiers would suffer this fate very often, especially early on when they started fighting for the Union. But they weren't paid the same. This comes up, like the idea that it would be okay for a black soldier to commit a war crime essentially against a white soldier, even a rebel. Now, I'm not saying it wouldn't happen, but that he would then say it to the president is crazy to me.
What's your name, soldier?
Private Harold Green, sir.
I'm Corporal Ira Clark, sir. 5th Massachusetts Cavalry. We're waiting over there. We're leaving our horses behind and shipping out with the 24th Infantry for the assault next week on Wilmington. How long have you been a soldier?
2 years, sir.
So that's a little early if this is 1864, which it probably is. The first official black soldiers were in the summer of 1863. I guess it could happen, he's just speaking with his language. There might have been soldiers too earlier than that. They maybe just weren't units.
2nd Kansas Colored Infantry, they fought bravely at Jenkins Ferry.
That's right, sir.
They killed 1,000 rebel soldiers, sir. They were very brave. And making
Of course, he just said that they killed them by committing a war crime, but
$3 less each month than white soldiers.
That's 2nd Kansas, boys.
Another $3 subtracted from our pay for our uniforms.
So this uppity private here is back talking the president of the United States right now, and the commander in chief. Now there's a lot of exposition here. They're explaining a lot of things to an audience that probably wouldn't know about differences in the pay and the lack of fairness, and it wasn't fair. And the Union was there to end rebellion, not to end slavery. Ending slavery was, if anything, a punishment for rebellion, and to the extent that they utilized black soldiers, it was because they needed them. This would lead to a lot of civil gains for black soldiers later. I mean, they became veterans. It's hard to ignore them at that point. It's hard to treat them as low as they maybe were before. But this is still a highly stratified and white supremacist society. In fact, during the siege of Petersburg, there was a Union black soldier, who was accused of rape. I don't think there's enough evidence to say whether it was true or not. But he was executed, and he wasn't just executed; he was publicly executed, and in fact, publicly executed in full display of the rebels. They wanted the Union officers wanted the Southerners to see, we will execute blacks. They wanted them to see, look, it's not, slavery might have been destroyed, and it was indeed destroyed through the course of the war. But that doesn't mean there's going to be equality between the races. We still believe in white supremacy, and the vast majority of people in the North did. There was obviously some exceptions who did not. Very debatable where Lincoln would actually fall on that. You could say it either way. I think the evidence, he said himself quite explicitly that he didn't believe they were equal. He said in the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates that, he made a point of saying, let me be very clear, I don't think there's equality between the races. Of course, people then argue he didn't mean it, and in which case, well, now he's a liar like every other politician, and then who knows what he means and doesn't mean.
That was true, yes, sir.
Equal pay now, but still no commissioned Negro officers.
I'm aware of that, Corporal Clark.
This is just blatant insubordination.
Yes, sir. That's good that you're aware, sir. It's only
Do you
that
think the woman's in the jacket?
now that white people have accustomed themselves to seeing Negro men with guns fighting on their behalf, and now that they can tolerate Negro soldiers getting equal pay, maybe in a few years they can abide the idea of Negro lieutenants and captains. In 50 years, maybe a Negro colonel. In 100.
Like, where's this guy's white officer who's just letting him talk to the president of the United States, the commander-in-chief of the military, the most powerful man on the continent, maybe the most powerful man in the world, who has martial and civil authority over everyone there, and even more so, they are without any doubt lower class than other soldiers, right? He's making this point that they get paid less, they can't be officers, they weren't even let into the army until 2 years after everybody else. They weren't treated the same by the Confederates. They were often executed or at least sold back into slavery. Something that, to the credit of the North, they objected to, and I think were able to tone it down. But this is like fan fiction. There's almost no way anything like this ever happened. And there's a point later in the film when not Lincoln but his wife, who is, she has high status. She's the first lady, but she's not the president. She's also crazy. Is in a gala with congressmen, senators and congressmen, and they're totally kowtowing to her because there's a rigid stratification of class here, and the first lady is above a senator or a congressman, and this is the president, so he's higher than she would be by an order of magnitude or two. And they are way lower. I mean, if they were even just white privates, they wouldn't be the same as a congressperson from Pennsylvania. And this kind of insubordination, sass, there's just no way this ever could have happened.
Years to vote.
So some blacks already could vote. This is actually something that was erroneously dismissed in the Dred Scott case. There were franchised blacks in the North at the time of the American Revolution. It wasn't a wide franchise. It wasn't in every state, but it definitely was a thing. So I guess he's talking about at the federal level, but at the state level, blacks already were franchised in some places.
you'll hire me.
Yes, I will.
Now you can't see this in the background. There, you now can see the president. You can see behind him, he's flanked by white Union soldiers, presumably officers, and they're just standing here, letting these two black soldiers like insult, and I'm not gonna say insult, but like this is highly insubordinate. Like there's no way this ever would have been allowed to happen. It's my understanding that Lincoln himself, I mean, again, said that he called all blacks, like when he would talk with them, which he would. It's not like he never spoke with black people, but he would call them auntie or boy, with the sole exception of Frederick Douglass, who he would call by name. But these guys are not Frederick Douglass. These are privates or corporals in the Union Army. And he's got this nice fatherly grin. It's just kind of implied that he's super nice and caring about these soldiers. But it's also the case that, you know, he was the commander in chief, and he did not champion these soldiers being in the army until 2 years into the war, after the North had lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Now, the war being what it was and power being what it was, it's not necessarily the case that Lincoln could always get whatever he wanted. But one of the telescopings of history that I think is really outrageous, especially with Lincoln, is that there were people who were true abolitionists. There were people who really believed in racial equality, like his Secretary of State, William Seward, or Secretary of the Treasury and later Supreme Court Justice Selman P. Chase. Never mind somebody like William Lloyd Garrison, right? There were people who truly were abolitionists. And then there was Lincoln. Now, Lincoln wasn't the most conservative anti-slave or anti-black person that existed. He was a Republican. He was a moderate Republican. It's very clear. He made it very clear quite explicitly that as big as an issue as slavery was to him, and he did think it was a big issue that needed to be addressed, but by that he meant restricting its growth in the territories, things like that. He was never talking about abolition at any point in his political life, even up through the first several years of the war. You know, in his first inaugural, he famously said if he could save the Union by freeing the slaves, he would do that, but he would also do it if without freeing any slaves, or if he could free some and leave others enslaved, he would do that. The Emancipation Proclamation, you know, this is, I mean, such a famous thing, and then it's also the second most famous thing about it is that it didn't really free any slaves because it didn't apply to any slaves that the North had any power over. So it exempted all the people in bondage in places like the border states, or the areas of Tennessee or Virginia or Louisiana that were under Union control at that point. So you could always say, well, he's just being a pragmatic politician, and that you know, his true heart, it was in abolition, and he believed in racial equality, but he never said that. And he certainly didn't act that way. And that doesn't mean that maybe he doesn't deserve credit or praise, or that, you know, his moderate position was still something that was laudable by today's standards. But I think it's wrong to then deify him as if he was, you know, an actual abolitionist, somebody who actually was in the trenches calling slavery evil, you know, like someone like William Lloyd Garrison is probably the best example. But there were many, many abolitionists like that. Frederick Douglass, great example like that, of people who put their lives and their fortunes on the line decades before Lincoln was president. And, you know, you could say, well, Lincoln put his life on the line. He put his life on the line for the war, not necessarily for his kind of tepid flirtations with emancipation. But I just can't imagine these white officers are going to stand around and let this backtalk happen from these two privates, these two African American, these two Negro privates.
But you should know, sir, that I get sick at the smell of boot black, and I cannot cut hair.
I've yet to find a man could cut mine so it'd make any difference.
You got springy hair for a white man.
My last barber hanged himself. And the one before that. Left me his scissors in as well.
Now they're joking. They're just like best friends. It's just there's no way this ever happened. Like and it's fine. It's just like it's a movie, but they're trying to make it seem like you're going to get a much more accurate, unvarnished version of history because look at all the production costs and look at all the intricacies. We go into the politics of the 13th Amendment and the costumes and it seems like they're saying, look, we're really trying to show you how it really was. And then they basically show a pure fantasy thing. I mean, it might as well be Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter because there's just no way this happened. If senators and Congress people have to bow at the feet of the First Lady, there's no way these two guys are doing this.
President Lincoln, sir. Boys. We saw you at we were at
Okay, so like this is one of the cameos I was talking about. We have Dale DeHaan, and I don't know the name of the other actor, but he was in a lot of stuff. I think he might be the guy who was the kid in E.T. Obviously, he's an adult here. So these two other privates who are white show up, and it's important that they be white, and you can tell by what it says. Just listen to this.
You boys fight at Gettysburg?
Did you hear that? You boys fight at Gettysburg. So the black soldier just addressed the two white soldiers and called them quote, boys. You boys fight at Gettysburg. No way that's happening. Also, he's calling them boys, and it's like it's implied. Look, these two black soldiers are grizzled veterans, and sure, it's 1864, 65 here. They could be veterans. I mean, there was a lot of combat that a lot of blacks had taken part of, but there were also 2 years before that where basically no blacks were officially in the military. There were no official colored units. They were getting in there, but not like in large numbers. And in that preceding 2 years, hundreds of thousands of white soldiers were killed, and many, many more had become veterans who had experienced combat. And so we're talking about the Army of Potomac here. Again, not exactly clear when this is. It looks like it's fall 1864 or spring 1865. You would not assume that any soldiers there were new. Now, there were new soldiers who were making it in. Famously, at some point around here, some very large units that had been assigned to defend D.C. These were called the heavy artillery units. So, heavy artillery is artillery that is too cumbersome to be used in the field. You can't roll it around. It has to be mounted on a ship or on a train. And heavy artillery units aren't going to be with the Army of the Potomac. But where they are going to be is in major fortifications. And Washington, D.C. had, the most extensive suite of fortifications of any city in the world at this time. And people love to be in these units because if you're in a unit that's defending Washington, D.C., one of these heavy artillery units, you're probably never actually going to be in a battle unless D.C. gets attacked. And if it does, you're going to be in a battle when you're in a fortress with a huge cannon and. And so these units were popular, and so they became overcrowded. And instead of ostensibly a regiment would have 1,000 soldiers. By this point in the war, you often would have regiments with 10 soldiers or 100 soldiers. Very, very small numbers because of attrition. And these heavies, as they were called, could have 1,800 or 2,000 soldiers in them. So people would think that they were divisions because they were so big. And at some point in that summer, Grant said, look, we need more soldiers. We're losing many thousands per week. And they were, both sides were just attriting like enormous numbers. There's, to this day, debates about how big or small both armies were because they were losing so many soldiers through combat, through disease, through attrition, through wounding. And Grant ordered all these quote unquote heavies into the Army of the Potomac. And so they weren't technically, they had been in the Army for a while, many of them, but they had no combat experience. Turned out they did fine, and they got plenty of combat experience that summer. Things like the Battle of Spotsylvania, some of the most into Cold Harbor. Cold Harbor is a battle not as many people have heard about, but more people died in Cold Harbor, more Americans died in Cold Harbor in 20 minutes than died in all of D-Day. Right, the savagery and the lethality of the technology and the tactics were just so much worse than what they were in later conflicts. And so the idea that these two black soldiers are gonna like question whether these two white soldiers are veterans or not, at this point, there would be no reason. The odds are more likely that the white soldiers have been veterans longer, that they've been in more battles, that they could have been in the Battle of Gettysburg, where I don't think that there were any colored troops in the Battle of Gettysburg. There were the very first colored units did see action right around the time of Gettysburg, but not in Pennsylvania, down in South Carolina. There's a very famous movie about that called Glory. But there wouldn't have been any colored troops at the Battle of Antietam or Bull Run or any of those earlier battles, Chancellorsville, Fredericksburg, and it. But then the fact that he calls them boys, totally insane.
No, we didn't fight there. We just signed up last month.
Okay, so they just signed up last month, but he didn't know that. I don't know how he could have known that. Why he would have assumed that.
We saw him 2 years ago at the cemetery dedication.
Yeah, we heard you speak.
So they just signed up a couple months ago, but they were at Gettysburg and saw Lincoln speak.
Damn. Hey, how tall are you anyway?
Gee, shut up.
Could you hear what I said?
No, sir, not much.
So these guys are green as grass, not veterans, never been in a battle. They're white, and then they're bumbling and incompetent, and yet they went to this speech that Lincoln gave in Gettysburg, this commemoration of the cemetery there that's still there. Not that many people went to that. It was an event, but it's 1863 or 4 when that happens, in the middle of a war. And I mean, what did they just happen to live in Gettysburg, or they lived nearby, or they took the train to go watch? Like,
It was 407 years ago, our fathers brought forth from this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, but dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal.
Okay, so he starts to recite the Gettysburg Address. Okay, so he's a bumbling idiot. He's a total novice. He went to the Gettysburg Address and he memorized the Gettysburg Address. Now, it's absolutely true that the Gettysburg Address has become a super famous, oration speech. There's all kinds of controversies about, well, not controversies really, but there's people who say that Lincoln didn't really write it because, whatever. I think he probably did, but like, here's we wrote it on the train. It was taught in schools, and also like people would memorize it. Even when I was in school, it was common for people to have memorized it. But this is after the war. This is after Lincoln is essentially martyred and becomes a deity or a demigod of some type. At this point, he's the president, and it would be like somebody going and like starting to recite back a speech that Trump had given, or Biden. And you could say, okay, not Trump, but like Obama, anyone, Clinton, nobody. I mean, it just seems totally inconceivable that these guys would be so enthralled to his words that they just happened to see. So that they were huge, I guess, Republican fanboys. They were super, super, super into Lincoln, but then they didn't join the war. They signed up last month, which, okay, maybe, well, you say, well, maybe they were too young. Okay, so if they just got old enough, so they turned 16, 17, 18, and so 2 years before they were 13, 14, and they were that gung-ho about going to Gettysburg to see the Gettysburg Address, which, again, it subsequently became this famous oration, this famous speech that millions of Americans would be forced to memorize. But nobody knew that was going to happen at the time. Lincoln's even says there, oh, you could hear me, because that was one of the comments that people made, is that they couldn't hear him very well, that nobody really clapped, that it was very brief and he was done. And there was another oration by a guy named Edgar Everett, who I think spoke for like 2 hours, and he's a famous orator, and that's what people talked about at the time. So it just, they're like it's quite fanboy here what they're doing.
Good, thank you.
Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing
Oh, so they both memorized it.
whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long do it. We're met on a great
And he's stammering because he's not articulate because he's a stupid white boy.
battlefield of that war.
That's good, thank you.
We come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live.
His uncles, they died on the second day of fighting.
I know the last part. It is, it is rather...
Who is this going to find?
Okay, maybe. Okay, so they say his uncles died on the second day. So Gettysburg was a 3-day battle. So maybe that's why they went to the ceremony. Maybe. Okay. And then they were so enthralled that they learned the Gettysburg Address.
Your company. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
God bless you. God bless you too.
He tells those boys to get back to their company. Oh my God. Okay. So the white boys walk away. The two black guys are starting to walk away. And as they walk away, Lincoln, the president, stands.
That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation under God
Watch.
shall have a new birth of freedom.
And he turns his back to the president and walks away.
And that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
And they get the entire text of the Gettysburg Address into the movie, spoken by 3 different actors in sequence. Of course, the black actor is eloquent and articulate and confident, and is honored by Lincoln, and the white ones are stammering idiots. And it's totally fair to think a private in the Army of the Potomac at any point, including at this point, might not be super smart. A lot of them were men of letters and were literate for sure. That's why the war is so well documented, because there was such a high amount of literacy. But there definitely were people who were not illiterate or barely literate. So not implausible there. If we're going to compare the average white soldier to the average black soldier, again, there would be some variance there. Obviously, there were some blacks who were educated, who had been to Harvard or Yale, who'd been to Hawthorne, who were from New England, probably Massachusetts or Boston. There were blacks who ran newspapers, but a lot of them were slaves or ex-slaves and were probably totally illiterate. And the average literacy rate, I'm sure, was lower among blacks than it was whites. Now, it's not implied so much of the 2 black soldiers. One of them obviously has a higher level, higher command of standard English. He's clearly more literate. The other one less so. But both of the white boys are total bumbling, novices. So that's that whole interaction is just completely preposterous. That all these privates during a deployment, on the eve of being marched off to go do something, are going to be chatting with the president in this way. Not that he would never chat, but that they would then, especially with the black soldiers, be basically back-talking him and questioning his authority and questioning his policies. And I mean, again, this is an army that was executing black soldiers for crimes and doing so publicly so that the South could see, look, yes, they're in an army, but no, they're not equal. And they weren't equal. I mean, he made that point. They were not equal in the North. They were not equal in the Army. They wouldn't be equal in the Army until 100 years after this, really, until the segregation was ended in the Korean War. I mean, all the way through World War II, they were not equal. 100 years after this, essentially, almost. And so, of course, Daniel Day-Lewis is amazing in this film. So, anyway. All right. Well, this was just a little bit of a test. I hope you guys are all doing